It's always a pleasure to be joined by Alice Stolz, Domain's Managing Editor. Alice, we're 1 month into the spring selling season. How are the numbers looking?
The numbers are looking really good because we're seeing that coming through in the clearance rates, and Melbourne and Sydney in particular have had really high levels compared to where they were this time last year.
What are the clearance rates in places like Sydney and Melbourne?
So Melbourne and Sydney at the moment are around 70%, and that's coming off the back of lows in the 40% range last year. So we're seeing a real marked improvement, and we know that's because we've had the federal election in May, where everything kind of solidified into place, negative gearing was taken away, lending also became more easier for people, and I think there's a sense of urgency now that interest rates are being cut again, and people were holding off for the spring stock listings to rise. So we talked a little bit about the fact that in the springtime people want to buy in spring when stock levels are higher. The volume levels still are not on what they were 2 years ago, and sort of the boom was beginning to really take hold.
So you think the fact that the clearance rates are high is because the stock levels are still quite low?
Correct. Particularly in Melbourne, stock levels like this time last year were still lower than what we were. We were 14% lower on stock than what we were this time last year. So we're still not seeing that stock coming right up to those levels yet. But I think out in the market, there's a sentiment it is starting to build, but it might not really go through until next year.
So what are we looking at there around the states?
So basically, Sydney's clearance rate for August and September was 71%, which was the highest since April 2017. And the clearance rates are highest in Sydney's inner west. And it's interesting, guys, in September, 30% of vendors opted to sell prior to auction, which really shows that people are saying, I want that property and I'll do anything to get it, and not waiting to go to auction, and are selling prior. In Melbourne, the clearance rate for September was 71%, which is the highest since July 2017. And the clearance rates in Melbourne are highest in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. Stock levels are still rising, but not quite on what they were last year. And last month in Melbourne, 5% of sellers withdrew their home before auction, which was down on year, because basically it means that people aren't getting cold feet. Sellers are feeling quite confident in their selling ability.
Right.
Adelaide's been a little bit of our black sheep, hasn't it? It's coming, well, not the black sheep, I'd say the dark horse is the phrase I'm looking for there.
That's it, Shell. It's a clearance rate of 59%, which is the highest since February 2018. But basically, Adelaide prices have fallen recently. So what we're seeing there is a little bit different from what we're seeing in Melbourne and Sydney, but auction numbers are the same as what they were a year ago.
We know that that Perth is a bit of a boom and bust town. It's quite interesting to see it so low clearance rate wise. I mean, what are we supposed to make of that?
It's so interesting, Chris. So basically, the clearance rate is always low in Perth, but it was 50% back in 2013. Wow. And I mean, will we ever see that again? Who knows? I don't know the answer to that. But basically, the clearance rate in September was only 12%, but it's been around 20% in 2019. So it's really interesting what's happening there. It's so different than what's happening in Melbourne and Sydney.
Yeah. If we head back to the eastern states for a moment, I mean, you were talking a little bit about the psychology from both vendors and buyers. Do you think this urgency is particularly, I suppose, fierce when it comes to first home buyers who are not buying and selling in the same market that they have been, but are maybe trying to make the most of what has been a kind of a grim couple of years?
I think that's spot on. I think for first home buyers, they don't have the pleasure of being able to sell an asset that they bought years ago and made a lot of money on. So they, I think, feel absolute urgency to get in now, knowing that prices are going to rise. We know that with rate cuts, prices will rise. You know, we know that when clearance rates are around 70%, we've seen this historically in Melbourne and Sydney, prices will rise around 10% the following year. So we can expect that pattern to happen. So if you're a first home buyer in those markets, now that clearance rates are around 71% in Melbourne and Sydney, it's kind of your warning sign. You're going to have to get in now before prices rise.
With this good news that's coming, I guess, are we seeing more listings coming on board? Are people seeing that September has been pretty good, and of course the market's looking good? Are we going to see more listings come onto Domain soon? I
think there's a sentiment that people had hoped there'd be more listings than what we've actually got at the moment. So that's why I think sellers are kind of thinking, do I go now or do I wait until early autumn next year? And we've talked about that sort of urgency to get in now before Christmas time, but whether or not that happens, particularly in Melbourne, stock levels are lower than what they were last year. And, you know, we know that Melbourne is a really strong auction market, so it's slightly unfortunate listings aren't as high in Melbourne, but obviously people are just still feeling that bit of uncertainty about it.
Oh, it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks, isn't it? Leading up, of course, to our block auctions, but then moving through summer, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, definitely.